first, the issue of sectarianism, right? David brought up this morning, and others have mentioned. When people first got into these archives, they were sort of stunned by the lack of sectarianism in the way that we thought that there would be sectarianism. There is a kind of sectarianism in there, but it's not in the way that we thought. But before getting into that, I'll just fast forward a little bit. And when you look at contemporary Iraq today, right, and especially the issue of sectarianism, ISIS, you see a lot that is sort of manifestations of ideas that were ingrained into Iraqi society by the previous regime. I know my colleague from NPS, from Monterey, Craig Whiteside, is here, and we've sat and sort of compared notes, and he's gone through all the ISIS files, and I said, hey, they're using this term and that term, and he says, yeah, ISIS is using this term and that term, and it's really the same, right? Now, first of all, I'll get onto some thin ice here by saying that I don't want to imply that the Baathists just became ISIS. I know there was that whole stream of literature out there. I don't really think that's the case for a number of reasons. Pre-2003, but I know there's other people here in the audience who have done a lot of work post-2003 saying that's not the case. So what is there, right? We see groups like ISIS and other just Sunni actors in Iraq, when they discuss Shi'is today, using certain terms, right? A lot of these terms have a kind of ethno-nationalist veneer to them, right? So terms like Safawi, right? When you want to describe an Iraqi Shi who's done something bad, you could call him Safawi or Majus, right? These are both terms that refer. Safawi is Safavid, right, from the Persian Empire. Majus is another kind of derogatory term for Zoroastrian. They both have heavily Persian connotations rather than strictly religiously Sunni Shi connotations. And there's other words like this that are used. And this comes straight out of Baathist literature, both inside the archive and outside of the archive, because the Baathists, being an Arab nationalist state, like to use the ethno-national lens, right? So, as mentioned earlier, they don't discuss Sunni Shi, right? Under Baathist ideology, the Shi'is are fine, right? The Arabs, I mean, it's not as simple as that, but they like to think of themselves as saying Shi'is are fine, and Arab Shi'is are fine as long as they're Arab, right? The problem is these Persians have come in, and this is Baathist ideas, not me, right? The problem is that these Persians have come in and polluted the pure Arab Islam, including some forms of Shi'ism. So good Iraqi Arab Shi'ism, bad Persian influence of Shi'ism, which is not even real Islam, according to the Baathists. Now, these ideas sort of permeated Iraqi society. If you look back, it was this lens that people would discuss it. It wasn't a straight Sunni Shia sectarianism. And if you look back through the archives, you really have to rethink a lot of the things that we thought we knew about the regime being this kind of strict Sunni Shia sectarian. Even some of the main ideas, 1991 has been brought up here several times. And if you read, I mean, the secondary literature on this, you'd almost think that, or you would think, right, it says very explicitly that this was, the regime came down in a very sectarian way and turned sectarian after that, right? And that there was these signs up, no Shi after today, was raised up, and this Sunni Republican Guard came down and crushed these Shis. And from then on, there was these articles in the Baathist newspaper Thawra that sort of denounced Shis, right? And from that point on, a lot of people said, well, Saddam had just turned strictly sectarian. What you find in the archives is that's actually not the case, right? First of all, a lot of the leaders that are putting down these uprisings are themselves Shi. Now, they may have been acting in a very nasty manner, and there might have been some people saying, some bad things about Shis, but a lot of the leaders of this, right? Mohammed Zubaydi, for example, was the commander who put this down, who was a Shi himself. So the idea that he ordered a sign to put up to say, no Shi after today, probably didn't happen. These articles in Thawra, which you find in the archive, is that there are competing factions within the regime. Some people are saying this kind of thing, right? And then other people are coming back within the regime itself and saying, we can't do that. That's bad. Most of our population is Shi, we're not going to be able to rule the country if we go down this route. And what you find is those people, the latter, won. They won that internal debate. And the people who are pushing for a hardcore sectarian line, which I think is actually the people who, some of those people published these articles in Athaura, which don't have a byline, were actually removed. They were purged from the regime in the early 1990s, right? And you see repeatedly the regime cracking down on anybody who stands up and says, Shis are bad, right? Or anyone who even starts to go down that route is going to be stopped immediately by the regime. And the same Shis who said similar things about Sunnis, right? And this was really, I mean, it was a massive, that was probably that was probably the #1 taboo in Iraq in the 1990s that the regime enforced. And those ideas have sort of permeated. You talk to Iraqis, like, you know, these ideas are still there, and especially among the Sunni population. And I think it's important that we understand this when we understand how ISIS speaks, right? Or just how Sunnis interact with the Shia population today. ISIS obviously is a hardcore, you know, sectarian, anti-Shia organization, but they have to talk to a population, right, to sell their ideas to some extent still. And this is why I think they're using a lot of these terms, right? But you also see it in, for example, the Popular Mobilization Force. You know, this is various groups. Some have closer ties to Iran than others. And among Sunni Arabs in Iraq, it seems that, you know, a popular mobilization force that doesn't have ties to the Iranians, for them, is more legitimate. If you're just simply Shia, that's somehow okay, right? Now, oftentimes they portray groups that are just simply Iraqi Shia with no ties to Iran as Iranian if they want to delegitimize them, right? But this is the discourse in which the political conversation continues to happen, right? It's one of the reasons for understanding Sadr's sort of reemergence, right, or his increasing popularity over the last, you know, year or so, is that he's able to present himself as a legitimate Iraqi, right, rather than an Iranian back group. So I think this understanding this sort of ethno-national lens that the Baathists understood Sunni-Shia relations through sort of continues to permeate today into political discourse in Iraq. And if you try to understand Iraq simply along the lines of, hey, there's Sunnis and there's Shias, you're not going to really understand what's going on. Okay, the second issue I wanted to briefly mention is this idea of state-society relations. I think the last panel did a fantastic job, whether it was on, you know, the regime's ability to sort of reach out to second cities, or you know, down at the local level, or using these militias. There's been a ton of scholarship on this, a lot of it by the people here that spoke earlier, about how the regime outsourced, you know, even though they lost a lot of resources, you know, they outsourced their mechanisms of control to tribes, to religious leaders, to local officials. And what you end up with is that the regime actually has, and the state actually have a good deal of control in the late 1990s and the early 2000s over places, even over places in the south, right? Shia sections of Iraq, which much of the outside world consider them not to have this, have sort of control over. And this is an important idea because it's baked into the plans for the invasion itself, right? We could talk about debathification, talk about you know, elimination of the army, which were, of course, huge mistakes. We could talk about, you know, 100 other bad decisions by people in the Bush administration. But there is also a sort of intellectual foundation there that we shouldn't forget, or else it could be dangerous, because then you could look back and say, well, if we just fixed this debathification and, you know, and dissolving the army, and everything would have been okay. Well, actually, the idea of debathification was based on an idea of Iraqi state-society relations, in that the regime has, especially in the Shia sections of the south, the regime has lost control, right? And therefore, if you remove the regime, you're not really going to disrupt society in the south, right? The south in these Shia areas is operating in a kind of equilibrium. It's self-governing, right? The Hausa and the different groups that are down there are sort of self-controlling. And you can march straight through there, deal with the regime, destroy the regime, and that's not going to, the south isn't going to be really disrupted. You're not going to open up any kind of political vacuums. And you can see that this was not just in debathification, but in the way the force structures were for the invasion. when the planning was who was going to control what areas, right? Places like Najaf and Dhikar were given over to coalition partners, Spanish and Italian in particular, who had rules of engagement which basically said they can't do anything, right? I mean, they were just there for as a kind of political prop to say, hey, this is a coalition of the willing. We're you know, it's not just America and to some extent Great Britain, but we have all these other parties with us, right? So they're given control of these areas and told, there's not an issue here. This is going to be safe. Don't expect any kind of problems. Obviously, that wasn't the case, and it wasn't the case because the regime actually was exercising a lot of control. And when we removed the regime from those areas, it opened up enormous holes, which were filled by militias, Sadrists, Iranian type militias, and you begin to see here, you know, filling these vacuums, a kind of militiaization, I guess you could call it, of the Iraqi state, which you could argue the Iraqi state has never recovered from. It's been, you know, gone up and down at different times, and of course, post-ISIS, or in response to ISIS in 2014, a lot of these militias were reinvigorated or reactivated, but they have their origins in this early 2003 sort of misunderstanding of state-society relations in Iraq, and that continues to go on today. So I would just close by saying, you know, one of these, the sectarian issue really does give us a kind of sense of good news and bad news for Iraq. Good news being that it's not as sectarian as probably we think. The bad news being that for a large section of the Sunni population, rightly or wrongly, you know, the Iranian presence, which isn't going to go anywhere, is going to continue to be something that causes instability. As far as militias, you know, it's sort of more of an explanatory or an extra dimension of how we got to where we are today. I'm not sure it gives us any path forward, but it gets us beyond the debates simply about de-Baathification and into some larger debates, which actually scholars took part in, right? Scholars were also a part of this, depicting Iraq in a certain way, which led to certain plans being enacted in the way that they were. With that, I'll just...
Okay. David?
Thank you very much. So I have a chapter in a textbook, a pretty prominent textbook on the Middle East. My chapter's on identity and ethnicity, but we just did a third edition of it. And I was skimming through some of the other authors' chapters in December. And there's a chapter on government and opposition, where they rank countries in the Middle East based on how democratic they are. And Iraq was down at the bottom, right? It was down there with Saudi Arabia, with Syria, with Libya, with Yemen, and with Gaza, with the rest of the, what you could characterize, which we in political science technically call the basket cases. I argue that no, Iraq should be at the top. Iraq should be up there between Turkey and Tunisia, above Turkey and below Tunisia, as the second most democratic country in the Arab world. That's typically how people think about Iraq. They lump it in with failed states, or they ignore it. Despite the prominence of Iraq in American foreign policy, it's ignored in a lot of edited volumes. You look at any of these dozens of edited volumes that have come out in the Arab Spring, if Iraq shows up in the index, it'll be Iraq, Kuwait, occupation, invasion of, and US occupation of. So we either ignore Iraq, or we lump it as a failed state. Or we see its politics as being driven solely by sectarianism and external intervention. And part of this is people still see that political system that Iraq has today as being created. There's an original sin to it, right? It was set up under occupation, and so somehow we shouldn't, it can't be studied in a comparative context. It's different. It's maybe even polluted in some way. I'm going to argue something different today. Iraq's parliamentary democracy, despite that perceived original sin of having been birthed during the US-led occupation, has been remarkably durable, competitive, and inclusionary, perhaps too inclusionary. That democratic system in Iraq is it's almost 15 years old, right? It has survived a hell of a lot. It has survived sectarian civil war. It has survived intra-sect civil war with the 2008 Operation Charge of the Knights, where Shias were fighting Shias. It survived the withdrawal of US forces. It survived rule by a very venal and sectarian prime minister in Maliki. It survived the collapse of the Iraqi army, the loss of a big chunk of its territory to the Islamic State, the storming of parliament by protesters. It survived a Kurdish independence referendum. I can keep going. This damn durable and robust system. Now, there's huge flaws in it, right? There's lots of holes in the Constitution. We can identify all the problematics of the Iraqi political system. But any one of those things I just mentioned could have been a quote-unquote critical juncture that led Iraq in a different direction and brought the system down. None of them did. Instead, Iraq has held 5 elections in those 15 years. 2 in 2005, 2010, 2014, 2018, and every one of those elections was competitive and meaningful. Competitive in the sense that you had a huge array of actors. You had Islamists, you had secularists, you had communists, you had increasing cross-ideological cooperation. It was meaningful in that you actually had elected prime ministers. Iraq has had 4 different prime ministers since 2005, and it's had peaceful transfers of power between those prime ministers. And some of those transfers were pretty significant, including the first one, where power was transferred from Iyad Alawi, right, an American-supported secularist, to Iranian-backed Shia Islamists. Say what you want to about Bush and about the occupation. That willingness to allow the democratic process to play out and power to transfer to the last group the United States wanted to see hold power is something to commend. But also in this last election, the ruling Dawa party gave up power, and power was transferred to an independent, but somebody who came out of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, or whatever they called themselves this week. Actually, he was a communist before he was an Islamist, but that's another story entirely. It's also brought in additional people. This system has an uncanny ability to draw in new actors. There's lots of different Sunni Arab political parties and individual actors who are participating in the political system and have been for years. It brings in splinter Sadrist groups. It brings in groups who are opposed to the political process. Muqtada Sadr initially condemned that entire political process and tried to form a shadow government. Now he's a key actor in the political system. A lot of these splinter Sadrists, like the Hashid groups, they join up. A lot of Sunni leaders who initially were insurgents are now running for office, and even the Kurdish upstarts. So it has a remarkable ability to expand, to bring in new actors. And consequently, the vote shares become more dispersed over time. In fact, if you want to understand the dynamics of Iraqi politics, the best place to look might be Israel, where you have the similar sort of vote fragmentation. But God forbid you compare Israel to Iraq. So I'm going to argue today, to understand the protest and what's happening in Iraq today, there's 3 key features we have to take into consideration: inclusion, oil, and demography. So inclusion. So partly of a legacy of pre-2003 authoritarianism and partly because of post-2003 sectarianism, there's been a very strong impetus for inclusivity in Iraq, that the governments that are formed after elections include all the political factions in Iraq and their quote-unquote governments of national unity. This led to the creation of a system that in Iraq is known as the Muhassasa system, which originally was a sectarian appointment system in which the spoils of winning office were distributed across the sectarian groups. In this volume that'll be coming out, there's an excellent piece, one of the best pieces in the collection, I'd say. Sorry, but by Fanar Haddad, where he talks about the shifting politics of sectarian competition. And what he argues is that Iraq is no longer in an era where groups fear group extinction or group encirclement. In other words, politics is no longer existential. There's been a normalization of the rise of Shia-centric actors to power. Things that were controversial, Fanar Haddad says, in 2005 are not today, such as the idea of Muqtada Sadr participating, such as the idea of Islamists linked to Iran holding the upper echelons of the government. But the key thing is, no one today in Iraq imagines that the system can be overthrown in a sect-coded way, that the Sunnis can return to power. Everyone knows their particular group size and place, and that distribution across sects in Iraq, that's only minimally contested. And Haddad has a great quote by a former Speaker of Parliament, a very prominent Sunni politician, who in a television appearance right after the elections of 2018 said, quote, "Our share, the Sunni Arabs, is known. 6 ministries, 9 commissions, and more than 60 other positions of special grades. So what do we care who comes and who is the largest bloc and who is the prime minister? Why do I care? Whoever comes, we will say, this is our share, the Sunni Arabs' share, and they'll give it to us. They cannot say no, because this is agreed upon." So this is the key argument, this is a key point, that this Muhassasa system in Iraq isn't about Muhassasa Ta'ifiyya anymore. In other words, it's no longer about an apportionment of power in offices and government contracts across sect. It's now a Muhassasa Hizbiyya. It's about the apportionment across parties. And corruption has always been a part and parcel of Iraq's political system. So how does it work? After each election, the parties get together in ministerial positions in the right to appoint supporters in key senior civil service positions. The system's referred to in Iraq as wakala. There's somewhere between 500 and 1,000 jobs that are part of the system, including the party-aligned directors generals. Those parties get to appoint their people across these slots. Parties then control each ministry's budgets, and they can shepherd government contracts from those ministries to their supporters and their supporters' companies, some of which are shell companies. And those same political connections mean that when those government contracts don't lead to good provision of services or don't lead to adequate addressing the needs of the people, there's political cover to prevent investigation or prosecution. Parties can give letters of recommendation to their supporters that they get jobs in the government. So that's the first thing to remember, that inclusion, more and more parties are joining. More and more parties are becoming part of this distribution of spoil system, which isn't Sunni, Shia, Kurd. It's really about parties. And there's more and more, I can't believe I'm going to say this, more and more pigs feeding at the trough of getting their people government jobs. The second thing to know about the Iraqi political system is oil. This system in Iraq had the misfortune of being baked during a period of extraordinarily, historically high oil rents between 2005 and 2015. When the U.S. toppled Saddam in April 2003, a barrel of oil would have cost you about 36 bucks. When Jafari becomes the first elected prime minister 2 years later, in 2005, the price had risen to $50. It very quickly goes up above 100 and stays there. If I was allowed to have PowerPoint, which I wasn't allowed to, I would show you a graph of oil prices over time. And it's pretty flat, and then it gradually rises. Then from 2005 to 2015, it's unbelievably high relative to its historic point. There's a dip in 2009, but it comes back. It's over $100. That crashes very dramatically in 2014, 2015. Now remember, Iraq, 90 to 94% of Iraqi government revenue comes from oil. Now, there's a lot of political science literature, a lot of it written on the 4th floor of this building, that talks about it's not just about having oil. It's about whether or not those the rents from oil, come before or after a country has high-quality institutions that can funnel and use those rents wisely. Iraq might be unique in that its political system was formed and fully evolved in a period when oil prices were historically high and when state capacity institutions were extremely weak. So this is baked into the system. And Iraqi leaders have only governed in times when oil was extraordinarily high, when oil prices were extraordinarily high. And they weren't prepared for that drop in 2014-15. Public sector employment in Iraq is huge. There's different numbers depending on how you count fixed-term contracts, security forces, and Iraq's 176 state-owned enterprises. But it rose from about 1 million people in 2003 to about 6 to 9 million in 2015. Again, that oil price crash after the middle of 2014 led to a whole bunch of bad things in Iraq. Severe budget, fiscal crises, GDP contraction, despite growth in oil production, current account deficits widening, drop in gross revenues, rise of fiscal deficits, but most critically, after an appeal to the IMF, a hiring freeze in 2016. Okay. Third thing you got to know is demographic change. Iraq's population is young, and I mean really, really young. If I was allowed to put up a PowerPoint, which I wasn't allowed to do, you'd see this very steep population pyramid where you've got a lot of youth. And I'm not going to say youth bulge, because there's all sorts of connotations of talking about that, but 40% of Iraq's population was born after the U.S. invasion of 2003. Let me repeat that. 40% of Iraq's population was born after 2003. We talk about young populations throughout the Arab world, but the only two places in the Arab world that have a population distribution like that, where you have so many under the age of 15, are Yemen and the Palestinian Authority, right? If you count people who are 10 years or younger in 2003, so people who really hadn't come of kind of political consciousness of what's going on around them, 60% of Iraq's population do not remember the Ba'ath period, right? We talk to a lot of Iraqis who talk about Saddam, Saddam, Saddam. They're old fogies. 60% of Iraqis have only known that 2005 political system that I'm talking about today. And it's those Iraqis that have borne the brunt of austerity. We don't know a lot about these. Political scientists talk about cohort effects, how shared experiences shape a cohort. It's clear that different generations in Iraq had very severe, there's important cohort effects. I mean, Lisa Blade's book does a great job identifying these kind of exogenous shocks almost that happened throughout. Falaj Jabbar has written some nice stuff. This young cohort in Iraq, this generation has had very little contact with coherent secular ideology. Right? They came of age when the big populist ideologies of the late 20th century, pan-Arabism, leftist movements, are gone. Their greatest ideological exposure has been to Islamist influences and sectarian forms, which they seem to reject. They have lots of access to television and internet. So we're still trying to unpack how this youth, the 60% of Iraqis that only know post-2005 what they think, what they want. So let me come to these protests now in 2019. The protests were sparked by the demotion of this general, the number 2 in the Golden Division, the CTS. He was prominent, but he's just the spark, right? These protests are part of a longer wave of protests in Iraq from 2011, 2015, 2018, 2019. Slightly different. This wasn't summer. They didn't begin in Basra, the second city. These protests really began in Baghdad. But the protests are, it's not about overthrowing and replacing those old elites. It's about radically reforming the system. It's about corruption. It's about poor services. It's about high unemployment and about that hiring freeze that was necessitated because of the drop in oil rents. It's directed at both the elite, but also that entire political system. Those exile parties, but also, critically, all those other indigenous parties that have been co-opted, I'm using that word political in a loaded way, but have been drawn into the system and are implicated in the distribution of rents and spoils in that system. There's a reason why last year those protesters in Basra and other southern cities targeted the offices of political parties. Their main demands have been the end of those austerity measures, in particular the renewed public sector hiring and, of course, the improving of services. So the response of the government in the past 2 years, but especially in the last 2 weeks, has been increasingly violent. Last year in September 2018, there was some protesters against violence. Again, there was some violence against protesters. But in the last week, past 2 weeks, I should say, the Iraqi government has really used force. The security forces and some paramilitaries, it looks like, fired on protesters. Between 100 and maybe 200 protesters were killed, and about 6,000 were wounded in these 2 weeks of protests. There's also been a crackdown on journalists. There was an internet shutdown, very ham-handed internet shutdown, I might add. And you know, a lot of Iraqi journalists and activists are getting messages. Friends in the security forces are telling them that their names are on lists and that they should go to Erbil or go to Jordan for a little while until things calm down. So a lot of Iraq analysts are now saying that this is a transformative moment in the history of Iraq. Toby Dodge, I think, is saying that this is something different. Before I conclude by talking about 4 options of where Iraq might be headed, let me just remind you of all those earlier things that happened that could have been critical junctures. It's premature to say right now that Iraq's heading in a different trajectory, but I think these 3 factors I laid out, that norm of inclusivity, of bringing all parties in and having national unity governments, that drop in oil prices, of a system that was where oil prices are baked in, and those demographic challenges suggest that it's been 15 years of stability for the political system, but this is an unstable equilibrium. This is no longer an equilibrium, right? Something's going to change. So where's Iraq headed? 4 different possibilities I see. One is that the system muddles through. The political elite see that they have see these protests as an existential threat, and they circle the wagon. They tolerate increasing repressive use of state force, and maybe even a limited concentration of coercive capacity in a politically weak prime minister. In other words, maybe the parties all want a prime minister who's strong enough to repress protesters, but not strong enough to move against any of them. Somebody like Maliki, but weaker. And then they're just going to pray for a rebound in oil prices. That might be the most likely outcome. See how long it can muddle through. The second is the possibility of the political elite splitting. The most likely fissure in a split would be between exiles and insiders, between those who came back in 2003, those 7 major exile parties, and the insiders. But this sort of split is less likely over time because of demographic change. The youth don't really remember who are exiles and who weren't. Muqtada Sadr looked different from 2003 until about 2014, 15, but over time, they're just as invested in the system as others, some would argue. Toby Dodge argues that, for example, in a piece. That sort of split very quickly could become generational, which is threatening to an awful lot of people. And that an insider versus exile split, that also would require Muqtada Sadr to go all in And he's very unlikely to do that. I mean, the future of Iraq is muqtadas, right? One way or another. He has very little incentive to risk everything right now when he's going to inherit the country and state eventually. It also requires him to reconcile with splinter Sadrists and for regional Sunni Arab rivals to sit together. The third possibility is that Iraq somehow abandons this norm of inclusion and national unity governments and allows a real opposition to form. In other words, it's not, the current prime minister of Iraq is very weak, and he's backed by these two large coalitions. This would require Iraq to actually make a move towards a more democratic system, where you have Likud in blue and white, right? Where you actually have different groups competing to form a government with the knowledge that others are going to be outside. This is really politically complicated, though, because this is caught up in other states' concerns over who, quote-unquote, controls the Iraqi government. The U.S. and Iran share a goal of neither of them wanting to be responsible for what happens in Baghdad, right? Iran doesn't want to be, they don't want to control that government with all the problems that are coming down the road. So inclusion, move towards greater democracy would be nice, but that's difficult. The fourth possibility builds on this widespread feeling that after 15 years, this parliamentary system is not working, and that something else is needed. This move might start with the dissolution of parliament and then either new elections, maybe with General Saadi, that general who was dismissed, running as some kind of uber reform candidate, or maybe parliament will be dissolved and just never reconvene. The most dangerous, not dangerous, but the most concerning view here is Marcina Shumri, one of our authors. In a different piece, she writes about the Iraqi youth's romanticization of an authoritarian past, how Iraqis who don't remember that time of the Ba'ath look back on the Ba'ath period as a time when a strongman ruling from the top down symbolized Iraqi national unity and strength, and that maybe it's better to have a dictator. And what's ironic about this view is that view that she finds Iraqi youth holding is the view of Kenan, is the image that Kenan Makia wrote in 1989. It is completely inconsistent with the view that every other presenter here gave us of the nuance of how the system actually worked under the Ba'ath. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Wonderful, thank you. So before I go to questions from the floor, I just wanted to throw one question to each of you and try to maybe push you a little bit beyond what you said. Sam, you do a bit more of this in your book and in the paper you wrote for the collection, but I wanted you to elaborate a bit more and maybe trace through this theme of the role of the Sunni establishment that Saddam created and how it adapts to 2003 and the place that it has in the insurgency in terms of legitimating or contesting, as it were. And if you'd like to connect that all the way up through the Islamic State, that would be fine. But I'm actually more interested in the insurgency period and like what happens to all of those Islamic authorities that Saddam helped to promote and bureaucratize, as you described, and how that plays in the 2003 period. To David, so there's a tension, a very interesting tension, which you acknowledge at the end in the argument you're making about Iraqi democracy. So you're very clear that it's been robust and resilient through these enormous challenges, and it is quite shocking and interesting to think about it that way, in the ability of the system to handle all of this turbulence and, frankly, near existential challenges in terms of the civil war, ISIS, and the like. But at the same time, as your comments later start getting at, I think for most Iraqis, the experience of democracy is not a particularly pleasant one. It's widely seen as, kind of unresponsive, corrupt, the party leaders just do whatever they want, and there's not a lot of representation or accountability built into the system. And so I think one of Toby Dodge's points, and one that you could get more out of by looking at, say, the Lebanon comparison, is that the way that you have things structured, which basically forces sectarian voting, means that there's no real reason for political parties or politicians to be responsive. and very few mechanisms to allow them to be accountable. It's sort of a self-perpetuating, ruling class, which is precisely what the protesters seem to be protesting over the last 3 years, and especially in this current iteration. And so I think there seems to be a gap between the resilience of the system and what we know about its poor governance and its corruption and its distance from from what much of the Iraqi population wants and seems to feel that they need. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and does it make sense to call Iraq the second most democratic country in the Middle East, or to say that Iraqi democracy is resilient when it seems to be so profoundly failing in many of the functions that we typically would assign to democracy: representation, accountability, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay, so well, first I'll say, it's important to talk about what types of continuity there was, and what kind there wasn't. But to do that, you kind of have to understand. I mean, in 2003 is a big break. Sometimes with people, but a lot of times with their ideas. So what Saddam did was, just to go back a little bit further in history, is he realizes he has a problem in the 1970s with the religious establishment in the country. They're a sort of competing position of authority, or competing source of authority. So he gradually tries to bring in his own, or replace the religious authorities that are in the country with his own religious authorities that he feels are more loyal to him and willing to sort of do what his bidding. And he's successful to this in some extent. Sometimes this means just, I mean, they create a whole university at one point to just create their own people, which is important. Those people play important roles. The university was created in the 1980s, and by the 1990s, they become the basis of this faith campaign that he launches. But it's important to remember that this system is very imperfect, right? It does what he wants it to do, in the sense that it gets all the religious leaders saying all the right things that the regime wants it to say. But it doesn't mean that those religious leaders in private necessarily support the regime, right? So, you have a number of people that don't actually, in private, toe the regime's line, right? Sufi Samari, right, is a Salafi. You have Abdul Malik Asadi, who is, one of the regime's sort of key people they're putting up there. As soon as 2003 goes down, those people change their colors, right? And we have some of their students have spoken out. Most of those guys, a lot of them have passed away now. Their students have spoken about how they had secret meetings in the 1990s, right? This is all done outside of the public view, right? And it was very dangerous. They all talk about that. Other people come from the outside, right? Harith Azari, right, who's one of the heads of the Muslim Scholars Council, right? He comes from, he's outside of Iraq. He's not allowed to be in Iraq because he has, apparently, regime suspects him of having ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. So he comes back. Other people that are connected with the Iraqi Islamic Party come back. So I would be careful about drawing these kind of clear lines, but saying, oh, he created this cohort of scholars, and this cohort of scholars acted in this sort of unified way after 2003. I don't think that can necessarily, you can make that case. Well, I think you can make the case, though, if you look at, what Harith Azadi was saying, it does line up with Ba'athist discourse a lot. And I think it's because they're operating in a political environment where, they're making certain claims and trying to get support, and there are certain discourses which will gain traction and certain ones that won't, right? So these early sort of Council of Muslim Scholars, if you look at their early rhetoric, it's not sectarian rhetoric. It's talking about occupation, right? It's talking about neo-imperialism. It's actually talking about anti-sectarianism in the same way. Now, a lot of these guys were sectarian, but they adopt this discourse of anti-sectarianism, which comes out of the Ba'athist idea. We're not against the Shi'is, right? But the problem is that some of these Shi'is are on the side of the Americans, right? And so this discourse actually this discourse actually continues. And then you see even, more of a break now, where a lot of these sort of leaders have either been killed or sidelined. I really like Fanar Haddad. His views on sectarianism have influenced mine tremendously, although I'm not as optimistic as he is. The situation I see right now in Iraq is, yes, Shias have a lot more leeway. Yes, they're a lot more legitimate. It's because there's really not any strong Sunni voices out there. They've been crushed. They were crushed first by ISIS and then by the counter-ISIS offense. And Sunnis have not been able to get this Sunni Arab population, whether it's going to be reconstituted or not, I think is going to be the big question of, as a political force, it's going to be the big question moving forward in Iraq. They haven't been able to get resources to rebuild their cities. A lot of people are in displaced persons camps, and the current government in Iraq just simply doesn't seem to care. Now, whether or not they can keep caring and reintegrate this section of Iraq, Mosul in particular, into the Iraqi political body will be a big question. But right now, the main issues that the Sunnis Sunni Arab population are concerned about are not being addressed by the regime. Rebuilding and having some of the worst sort of popular mobiles, the Hashid forces who are responsible for atrocity, they're just simply not being held accountable at all by the government. It doesn't seem like there's any way for them to be. So I think that's going to be a big question moving forward, to add maybe to your list of how this section of Iraq is going to be reintegrated, if at all.
So you asked two questions. One is about definitions of democracy, and the second one's a Lebanon comparison. So we can have, every first-year political science student talks about different concepts of democracy and how you measure them. But I think by almost any reasonable measure, Iraq is way up there in terms of elections, regularity of elections, participation of different political parties. Turnout was pretty high until this last election when it went down dramatically. But turnout Ashtarkiya in Iraq, and everybody gets criticized, left, right, secular, Islamist. It's pretty remarkable flourishing of media space. And Iraq is one of the very few Arab countries where you can stand in the corner and say the head of government, the prime minister, is a criminal and should be thrown in jail. I dare you to do that in many other places, right? So again, we can, yes, huge problems with the ability of the government to be held accountable, but some people would say that's a problem in a lot of democracies, including our own. In the Lebanon comparison, you go back and read these memoirs of all these American officials that served in Iraq, and Chris Hill's memoir is a good example of it. But I think Colin's old boss, Joe Biden, had a lot of this tendency too. They brought experiences from the Balkans to Iraq. And they were sitting, and sometimes they're clear. I mean, Chris Hill says, I'm sitting around the table with Sunnis, Shias, and Kurdish leaders. And I'm trying to figure out which one of them is Milosevic, which one of them is Karadzic. There was an experience there that they brought, and it shaped, I think, a lot of the decisions that they made or the solutions that they proposed. Middle East scholars do the same thing. Every Middle East scholar draws a comparison with Lebanon, and partly because it's the name sounds similar, right? There's no Kurds there, but you got Sunnis, you got Shias. There's a kind of an embedded sectarian system where power is divided among groups. But I think that comparison actually obscures just as much as it reveals, right? There seemed to me that there's a lot more new entrants into the Iraqi political system than you have in the Lebanese political system, right? So for the Shias in Lebanon, you can vote for Amal or for Hezbollah. Right? What are your electoral options if you're a Shia voter in Iraq? Tremendously varied. And parties are falling often. If I asked you people in the audience to name some prominent Shia actors in Iraq, you'd come up with a couple names. But if I asked you to name prominent Sunni Arab leaders, if we started naming them, we'd come up with 50, right? The original ones that were on the governing council, Pachachi, Ghazi al-Yawar, they disappear and new ones rise. So it's a really dynamic system where even if the group might be there, there's an awful lot of competition within those groups. And in that sense, they are held accountable, right? Parties lose votes. They lose power in government elections when government elections are actually held. So there actually is democratic accountability, even if it is within sect. But it's a much more dynamic system. You got a lot more entrants. You got a lot more basically groups that leave the political scene. And so in that sense, it's a much more robust, and it's not a self-replicating ruling class in that sense. You do have some names, and I disagree, I think, with some things Toby Dodge says in his memoir, in his memo for us, and that he sees the political system in Iraq today as still being dominated by those 7 exile parties that run the governing council. They're all there, but I don't think they dominate anywhere near to the extent that he makes it out to be. I think there's a lot of other new parties that have emerged and are implicated in that political system as well. So again, there's some similarities with Lebanon there. I think both of them parties have coordinated on a set of rules that this is how we're going to decide political competition until we don't. But I think the comparison obscures just as much as it reveals.
Okay, why don't we take questions? Sir?
I'm just curious. I know very little about Iraq. I've learned a lot this morning, but I do know that more than 100,000 people died as a result of the American invasion in 2003, and that means there are a hell of a lot of families in Iraq who have some, besides being anti-American, may have some other political interests in terms of the structure of the country, the structure of the government. And I'd like to know if there is, if they form any kind of political bloc, or are they as distributed among all the parties, as you said, in terms of the general population?
There's no political single bloc that represents people who lost people to the Americans, and some of the groups. Muqtada the Sadr clearly represented a segment of the population that lost quite a few people. Those 2004 uprisings, these Sadrs come out, they just get mowed down by the dozens, if not hundreds, in those uprisings. And so there might be there clearly is a memory there, but there's no single block. And it is spread over. An awful lot of Sunni Arabs, obviously, as well, were killed. So it cuts across that.
Just mention also that of that 100,000, and the number goes widely in all different directions. 100,000 is probably a more conservative one, but a very small fraction of that was directly killed. It's a result of the American invasion, but a lot of this is not directly killed by Americans. A lot of them are, but that's a smaller portion than are actually killed by different Iraqis. And I would argue, and David probably knows more about this than I, that institutional memory, that memory is actually longer. That, hey, those Sunnis came down here and blew up our mosque, or these Shias came up here and they're working with some other outside power against us.
Yeah, that's a good point. See, intra-group violence and even intergroup violence is really, really salient. So ISIS had a massacre of some predominantly Shia Air Force recruits at an abandoned U.S. military base called Camp Speaker. It's named after an American soldier who died, I think, in the invasion. But that is really salient, I think, for a lot of Shia's identity, especially in the immediate post-ISIS, when ISIS rose. So it's not just the Americans. A lot of the deaths were caused by other groups as well.
Ma'am?
So my question is, when you were showing how resilient is this totally new, or is it not new, Iraqi democracy? Why? When we have not seen resiliency in democracies elsewhere that were newly imposed on countries that do not have a history of democracy and have not built the institutions, etc.
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. I mean, my intuition is that, so there was so much effort. One lesson you could take from my presentation is that all this really detailed, trying to get the details right of the political system and the Constitution and the Supreme Court really aren't that important, right? If there's a minimally functioning system that every group, that the key actors have a shared interest in preserving, that's enough. And the gaps hopefully will be filled in over time. Larry Diamond, if he was still here, would probably disagree with me strongly on that. But no, he left. So I'd say in Iraq, two reasons. One is the there were actors who were very much opposed to the system, right? I mean, Muqtada Sadr tried to bring it down early on. There's lots of Sunni groups that wanted the system to be overthrown. I think the dynamics that Fanar Haddad talks about, how as the system survived and survived and survived, groups no longer saw that new system as posing an existential threat to them. That was key. And so maybe the presence of US troops for a period of time was important. But I think just as importantly, if not more importantly, was oil. That being part of that system and maintaining that and keeping that system there was a clear road of how you were going to get a share of oil to pay your supporters, right?
Sir?
So my question is directed to your presentation, Samuel, and that is the identity, the Shiite identity, and the differentiation that you're making about Shiites in Iraq and their aversion to Shiism as defined in Iran. We know that Muqtada al-Sadr just recently appeared right by the Supreme Leader during the most recent religious celebrations and observations that occurred in Iran. And that was actually intended to demonstrate the absence of a division between the two. So in that context, I'd like to know, and perhaps Lisa can comment on this too, is to what extent is there insight into the uprisings profile of whether those uprisings are primarily Sunnis or it's a mixture of Sunni and Shiites?
You're talking about the uprisings now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just clarify also that a lot of what I was saying, I don't necessarily, about this separation, I'm not sure that that is a proper representation of reality. It was a representation of a discourse that was portrayed by the regime that has had a lot of traction among Sunnis and was actually adopted by some Shia elements within Iraq. There were a lot of Iraqi Shias who tried to differentiate themselves from Iranians, maybe not because they believed it, but because they saw some sort of, maybe some of them believed it, you know, it's hard to tell, you know, a lot of them maybe have never even thought about it, right? But they saw some benefit to differentiating themselves back then. Sadr, you know, plays an interesting role here. Sure, he goes there to have this FaceTime, but he has to go there to have this FaceTime, right? If this was not a question, he wouldn't be having that that interaction, right? He needs to show that he does have this because there are a lot of people who question that, right? And actually, it's benefited him inside of Iraq because he stayed in Iraq, right? He's not like these scary guys who went off for Badr or someone like that, right? You know, he has this story that, you know, his father was killed, but he stayed in Iraq and he suffered. And there was this tension between, you know, especially early on in 2003, you know, between groups that had left in exile in Iran and groups that had stayed in Iraq. So he tries to play both ways, right? And obviously, if he gets in trouble, right, and was it 2008 or whatever it is, he takes off to Iran to do some seminary work, right? So it's not as clear, right? And these are very muddled. And identity in southern Iraq is very muddled in this way. And David spent way more time there than I have. And the protests, I think it's probably also a mix, right? You're going to have some people who, I mean, they're out, it's hard to know. It's very disorganized, right? Some people are trying to take control of it, are trying to, you know, set the agenda. There are clearly some elements that don't like Iran, right? They burned down the consul or whatever it was, but there are also probably other ones who, you know, go back and forth to Iran all the time and have relatives in Iran and love Iran and don't see of Iran. You know, so I would be careful of this protest trying to categorize it right now as this way or that way. I think we'll have to see which way it goes, and then people will probably try to read back to this period and say, oh, of course it was going to go, you know, but I don't think it's clear. Yeah.
Let me say something. So, yeah, there's this picture of Muqtada sitting next to the Supreme Leader, but I can show you a picture from a few months earlier of Muqtada sitting next to Mohammed bin Salman, right? And so he went there, and there's a lot of speculation of why. I think the most common explanations people have is that there's a possibility of the prime minister falling, and Muqtada was going there to explore whom the Iranians would support to be the next prime minister. But I got to say, Muqtada is not a pawn of the Iranians, right? Muqtada Sadr, it's his father, Mohammed Sadr, who's important, but also Mohammed Bakr Sadr, whom he's married to. There's a lot of family connections, but not just that. There's Lisa's heard me say this before, there was a Western official that sat down with Southderists soon after an invasion and talked about how this was, the Southders are the most cosmopolitan and most famous Shia clerical family in the Shia world. And that was Gertrude Bell in 1923. That's still true of the Southderists. And it's not just religious leaders. Hadith al-Dhari, people say he has legitimacy because his grandfather participated in the 1920 uprising. Muqtada Southders got a grandfather that led the 1920 uprising. He has another relative, Muhammad al-Southdar, who was the Rasputin of Iraq during the Regency period and was, I think, the first Shia or the second Shia prime minister of Iraq. So that Southdar family is really, really well known. And so the idea, when he's seen next to the supreme leader, I don't think Iraqi Shia think of him being controlled in any way by them. I think they know that they're not Iranian. It's actually a Lebanese family. They're a Sharafuddin branch. So, I mean, Iraqis know that he's going there, and as Sam was saying, it's showing that he has some influence with them. Now, when the supreme leader on his Twitter feed puts a very particular picture up of Muqtada with his hand on his heart looking up at him, that's him also performing, trying to show that he has influence over Muqtada, perhaps more than he really does.
Lisa?
I'll just add one thing about your question on the uprisings. I think it's a little too soon for us to know exactly who's participating and what the social bases are. But what I can say is the best thing that correlates against the 1991 uprising participation, so we know which districts or which areas broke out an uprising first, is actually the number of people on a per capita basis who died during the conflicts during the 1980s and 1991. So it was the places with the largest number of war casualties that were the first to have outbreaks of uprising then. So to me, you know, there is a relationship between sectarianism and paying war costs. Many, many, many more Shi'is died in the conflicts of the 1980s and early 90s. But I think it wasn't necessarily a policy of let's put the Shi'is out there on the front lines. It was a who can we force to go out there? Who can we recruit? Who are relatively poverty-stricken people in this country who can't buy their way out of service? And so then it really isn't a sectarian logic. There's more of maybe a political economy of conscription that might be the more relevant story. And we just, you know, we need to do some analysis about who's really struggling and suffering these days under power blackouts and brownouts, who's not getting water. And those factors may actually be bigger determinants of who's engaging in protest behavior today than identity, so to speak.
Just to add, I mean, as we know, one of the outcomes of 2004 to 2006 was the great ethnic and sectarian unmixing. So it used to be that those neighborhoods probably would have been afflicted in kind of a cross-sectarian way. If you happen to live in that neighborhood and the power goes out or the water's bad, everyone's affected equally. Whereas now you're much more likely to have more homogenous Shia districts and towns and Sunni areas. And so it might appear to be sectarian, but that's more a function of the way the city looks now than about an intent, I think, which I think gets at this question of why are the Shia population, you know, being so badly served if there's been a Shia government for, you know, basically since 2004. And I think that's a big part of it, is how the urban geography has been shaped. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for David.
Oh.
Is that okay?
I'll allow it.
Okay. So I have a question about the way you portrayed the Muhassasa system, and this is also building on Haddad's theories about it too, about this allowing for the routinization of politics, and this actually, even though it's a quite corrupt system, it's a stabilizing system. But I'm curious, it seems to be at tension with that other point about the system becoming more and more inclusive, and also it becoming a Hizbi system instead of sectarian. So is the Muhassasa system, even as it's congealing and stabilizing, does it actually contain within it these kind of elements of instability? How do you keep recutting the pie into these smaller slices if you have more actors? And then kind of another question, do you think the protesters have any fighting chance of actually undoing any of this, of the Muhassasa system, which is kind of at the root of all the inabilities to actually provide services, in addition to the oil falling? But will protests achieve any of their aims?
So great question. So I think you've identified what I think is the key instability, the key thing that's making the system unstable right now. Is the pie is being cut in smaller and smaller pieces. And I think the implication, and I don't know why you get entry in Iraq but less in Lebanon. But I will say that there's some natural implications of this. When I talk to friends from Lebanon or people I know in Lebanon, they're a Hezbollah family, right? Or they're an LF family. And that means when the LF asks them to do certain things, that they'll probably do it. When Hezbollah asks them to make sacrifices, to go out and vote and mobilize, they'll do it. My Iraqi friends they're not members of parties. Their family aren't members of parties. In other words, one brother will be a supporter of the Sadrists, another guy will be Dawa, another person will be unaffiliated. So there's more of a mixed strategies that families play, I'd say, and that's because of this instability. And I think that has implications, and again, this is speculation, and I don't know what the clientelism literature says on this, but I think there's implications for the ability of parties to demand things from their supporters or voters. I think parties in Iraq there's very few that can actually tell their people, go out in the street and mobilize or protest for us. And so that maybe the seeds of parties' own destruction is there, or maybe there'll be a winnowing out. Maybe the groups that aren't able to actually mobilize people will quit or do something else. The Islamic Action Organization is a nice example. They came back as one of the most prominent Shia exile groups, and they just found there was very little space for them, and they've become not even a regional party. I mean, they're basically a local party in Karbala, and they've shifted and they're focusing more on the Shirazi network and kind of clerical activism and things like that, which might in the future lead to something else. But so you might see some of these parties choose to go a different route. On the protesters, can they undo it? No, I don't think so. And this has been the call for a very long time. And the thing is, anybody who with any heft has weighed in on this long ago. I mean, Sistani has demanded the government reform in every single way you can possibly demand it in a fatwa, or in a private meeting, or a not private meeting, or boycotting meeting with officials. The pressure has come from the highest authorities in Iraq to do something about the system, and the system hasn't been reformed. And so I'm skeptical they'll be able to do much of it. And the thing is, these protests each one's not an independent observation. And so the government learned from the protests in 2018, and that's why the protests in 2019 look different. So after the protests in 2018, which were concentrated in Basra, the government promised a lot of public sector jobs in Basra, but then they also deployed a pretty repressive apparatus in Basra. There's a lot of evidence now that the government used tribes to basically pressure tribesmen not to participate in the protest. And then there were also two prominent activists in Basra who were assassinated in their homes. And a very clear statement to Basrawi activists, don't mobilize this time. So that's why there was perhaps less protesting in Basra in the past 2 weeks, but more in Baghdad. So again, they're not independent observations, and so it's hard to identify it. But it's unclear. I don't think they'll be able to pull down the system. And the big threat is, they pull down the system, what's next?
Thank you. Absolutely fascinating presentation. So I have two questions. One that might be a little tangential, but the first one is, I was wondering if both of you could speak a little bit more about the militiaization, I really like that phrase, of Iraqi politics especially. And so David, in your presentation, you had mentioned that there are militant groups that have transformed into political parties and have become integrated into the political system that way. And I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not, basically the effect that militant groups' transformation into political parties has had on the Iraqi political system at large, especially it's on the inclusivity, which I think, and accountability, which I think is really important. And whether or not I'd be interested in, I don't know a lot about this topic, but I'd be interested in hearing whether or not militants that transform into political parties maintain any type of security infrastructure, so that if, for example, their slice of the pie gets too small, they're able to use other means outside of politics in order to try to secure a more favorable distribution of resources. The second and kind of more tangential question is about oil. And so, David, oil seems to be this really key, important factor that influences kind of the domestic structure of Iraq. But I know Ross and Bowden have a really interesting ISQ article that came out in 2015, excuse me, about how the presence of oil and majority oil exporters interact very, very differently with respect to foreign policy than countries that don't export oil. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether or not you think that that foreign policy in any way was affected, or the government's pursuit of foreign policy in the way that it developed relationships with its neighbors was influenced by the fact that it formalized and kind of baked in at a time when oil prices were so high, and whether or not foreign policy changed once prices dropped.
Yeah, great questions. On the second one first is, I mean, yes, Iraq basically has normalized relations with all of its neighbors. I mean, there's a rapprochement with the Arab world. The Saudi national soccer team came and played in Basra a couple years ago and lost to Iraq. And the king of Saudi Arabia said he'd build the largest soccer stadium in the world in Baghdad to commemorate the relationship. So Iraq clearly wants to be brought back into the fold, wants to be involved in these oil things. But I mean, perversely, I think nobody will say this out loud, but I think, so we know Iraq wants high oil prices, right? If I was an Iraqi official, tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran isn't a bad thing, right?
Funnily enough, that's also true if you're a Saudi or an Iranian leader. Yes.
So I think there's a shared interest in maintaining uncertainty about oil supplies and oil prices. It doesn't mean everyone wants a shooting war. But I think Iraq certainly wants oil prices to be high. And the thing is that they also share interest with a number of other countries in the region in that sense. But Iraq's primary, I mean, all Iraqi political factions are basically unified around the idea of Iraq not becoming a battlefield between either the US and Iran, or between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between Israel and very Iranian-linked groups. So that's a key thing. But again, that's linked to oil prices. On this militarization of politics, so this is the big question, right? We've had groups with militias participate in Iraqi politics in the past. Muqtada Sadr keeps forming and unforming his militia, and they keep it as a reserve. There's an ongoing process now of what's going to happen with the PMF, but my personal view is I don't think we can even talk about the Hashid or PMF anymore in Iraq. I think there's so many different elements to it. There's certain groups that we should call them special groups, right, which was the name of the Iranian-backed groups from 2007, and they are special groups now. And Michael Knight has made this point most elegantly, and that's how we should think about them. There's other groups, though, that have become political parties and seem to be de-emphasizing the military aspect of them, the militias. Muqtada Sadr was the very first to say, yes, I will completely give up control to the Iraqi government. And so I think the PMF, there's a lot of different militias that are pursuing a lot of different strategies. Some really are being integrated in different ways. Some of them are demobilizing, going home. I think the bigger challenge, though, is a lot of these militias, a lot of these are just young men who feel like they saved their country and they now want to be rewarded for that, right? They've gone back to their homes and they want to be the big guys on campus now, and they think they deserve it. And so the question is do those guys get placed at the top of the queue for these government sector jobs, or do they basically allowed to become local thugs or mafia guys to do different things? And so it's not just the formal militias, it's what's happened with all these guys who believe that they sacrifice theirs by standing on some dusty road north of Baghdad for a couple months and go back and tell everyone they saved their country.
I'll just add to that in some ways you might expect that the militia would use their guns to sort of get political power, but I think it's more common actually going the opposite direction. These militias have formed political parties and are using political power to preserve the interests of the militia so that they don't have to disarm, so that they can continue to be a sort of force, or to be integrated, right? So into the military, get salaries, things like that. They're not necessarily they're not showing up and saying, hey, we'll shoot you if you don't make it. They're saying, we're a political bloc in parliament, and if you want our votes, like, you better make us, part of the defense establishment, which has been very controversial in other places in Iraq. In the Kurds, for example, like the Peshmerga is supposed to be part of, the ministry, and they're not. And then the Sunnis, who some of them, look at these different factions within the PMF, like as very problematic, seeing them become part of the government now. So it's a very controversial issue to bring them in, but they've used their political power to do that, not weapons. And the only other thing I would put with the oil is it seems that Iraq right now, if you listen to what especially the president, Barham Saleh, says, he'd like to position Iraq as this place that is kind of integrated into all these different networks in a way to sort of get the world not to forget about them, right? Because they say, hey, listen, when Iraq is screwed up, everything across the world is screwed up, right? Turkey is messed up because of the Kurds, Iran, the Sunni Arabs, and so we can, but if you make Iraq stable, this will stabilize the sort of region. So that seems to be their strategy now, if they, to the extent that they have one, is to be this kind of indispensable nation, almost like Syria used to present itself, to be that place.
So we're just about coming to the end of the session. So I want to try and connect the second and first sessions once again and invite all of the panelists, not just from this panel, and also Craig, if you want to jump in, or anyone else who's been working with these archives. In retrospect, where you are now, where perhaps you were kind of a qualitative researcher in the past, and then you began using the archives, or if you began with the archives and then were able to begin doing field work, are there things which you could not have understood or which fundamentally look different because of the one rather than the other? In other words, if you had been doing your field work, you would have believed this, but having worked in the archives, you actually understand it's very different from what people were telling you in the interviews and that sort of thing. Or the other way around, where the interviews and the qualitative field work have led you to fundamentally reinterpret what you found in the archives, making you perhaps have less confidence or change the way you interpret the things that that you found there by virtue of the kind of the real lived experience.
So I guess I did do field work in conjunction, right? I made multiple trips out here, and then I went to Jordan for a while. I talked with a lot of Sunnis who were in the regime. I've talked to some Shiis over the years, that were in the bat. One of the problems I found in field work, right, is first of all, you'll find very different things if you ask people. What I found was a lot of times, and this is just a problem with interviews and field work, oral histories in general, is a lot of the field work answers I got reflected the political situation in Iraq at that time, right? So for Sunnis, and I was someone, I think maybe it was David, mentioned, the young generations who said they didn't know Saddam and therefore they had this romanticization. It's not just that people didn't know Saddam. I mean, there were people who suffered under Saddam who say, now, that wasn't that bad. It's better than the Shiis, for some of these Sunnis. Right. I mean, or at least things, at least people weren't dying in the street. Even they give you all sorts of, and then they'll talk about how Saddam was not sectarian, how he loved the Shiis. One guy told me he was exiled from Iraq because Saddam loved the Shiis so much. This is actually one of the head of his projects in the head of the Saddam University for Islamic Studies, the inaugural head. He told me he was exiled because Saddam loved the Shiis too much. And then you'll talk to Shiis who will tell you there was no Shiis that supported the regime. The regime wasn't present in southern Iraq, and at first I really struggled from what I was seeing, not just in the archives, but in published materials at the time versus what people were saying. I said, well, maybe they weren't able to speak out. And then I've come to the conclusion that, I've started to sort of go focus on the documentary evidence from the contemporary sources, because things people were telling me just didn't hold up. And I would say, well, what about this and that? And they said, well, they sort of shuffle their feet and if you really try to pin them down. But it's still attention. And I sometimes, at night think like, oh crap, am I completely wrong? Because these people are telling me all this. But in the end of the day, I've sort of, I wouldn't say dismissed, but taken with a grain of salt a lot of the things I've heard about what happened in 1991 or whatnot, because a lot of it's been clearly refuted, I think. That's my...
David, you didn't use the archive so much, right?
No, but I will say I was in Iraq for almost a year, right after the invasion, living with an Iraqi family, really immersed in Basra. And I got to say, there's things that at the time I was trying to learn about that now I understand so much better because of the work of people around this table. I mean, I desperately wish, it's impossible, I wish I'd had the books that you guys have now, back then. So for example, I was interviewing a lot of clerics, and I was trying to understand the local office of the Association of Muslim Scholars, the AMS. And now I understand where these guys came from. I understand they were telling me their life histories and the training they went through, but I didn't know the context of the creation of those institutions that trained them. I understand the linkages between them better. The guy who was holding it and heading it in Basra, a really young guy who got assassinated a couple months after I left. I saw why he was kind of the key guy there, which I never quite figured out when I was there. Similarly, I was interested in local government and the collapse of local government. And people would talk about Mukhtars, but I didn't, and they would talk about the party, but didn't see the other side of that, right? The Iraqis were just, they knew the guy in their neighborhood was taking their name down, but there's this whole system above him and interplays within that. An Iraqi who I knew extremely well in town, she was a Christian widow. And she told me this story about her husband was murdered in her home, and then they were never tried. And she wrote a letter to Saddam. And there's this, it's a petition.
I've never met that's awesome.
She's in Detroit. I can introduce you to her. And there's a system to this was. It was, to her, it was just like almost like a random thing. And then to me, it was, she wrote this letter, and then she actually then had a meeting, I think with Saddam himself, and the guys ended up getting arrested, and they were released in the general amnesty right after the war, but that's another story. But it seemed like almost like I saw that story as basically just working outside the system, going to the top, going straight to Saddam. And so it kind of reinforced the prior I had, which was a very Kanan Makia-based prior. But if I had known everything that Alyssa has taught me back then, I would have seen it in a totally different context. The questions I would have asked in the field, the work I would have done, would have been completely different if I had any of these people's books up there. And so yeah, there definitely is an interplay.
Alyssa?
Well, that's actually a great point, because what I realized is that when you go to the archives and you see all the kind of the mechanizations, you realize the Iraqis themselves were not necessarily aware of all of that. And so sometimes I would come in and ask them about these particular relationships between their Mukhtar or the popular committee, and all they have is their own individual experience. And so they actually can't illuminate much. And the politics of memory is a big issue. What I found, what was very helpful is that, so, not by design, but I did the work in the archives first and then did my field work. And so I was obsessed with understanding the food rationing system, because this was I really got into it, but this was for me a way to understand state-society relations. Like it was a new system introduced in 1990. So it was kind of this great way to figure out the effect of sanctions on state-society relations. So I went to Erbil and I talked to all the IDPs from Baghdad, and all I wanted to talk to them about was food rationing. And they were, I think, just a little baffled, because to them, it's the most mundane, and they still get rations. And they're like, do you want to go to the rationing center? And I was like, yes, I was so excited, took photos. I mean, but so they couldn't, so a lot of times they would start out being like, yeah, we got like rice and beans, and okay, like what's the story? But because I already knew all the details of how it worked, I could then say, well, actually, so in 96, I heard that you guys started getting chicken. Is that true? And they're like, oh, well, yeah. And it would kind of prompt these memories and these anecdotes that would then kind of bring them out of some of their scripts. Yeah. There's been great work about how public memory can become a script. And so just kind of asking about these really mundane details would actually give me some of the most useful anecdotes. And likewise, doing all these interviews now about local government systems, a lot of the people I've been interviewing who are involved kind of don't understand what kind of information is useful to me, which is fine. But they'll kind of just walk me through how it worked generally. And I'd be like, no, tell me about a time when you were sitting on a council meeting and you saw like a dispute, what happened? And to the extent that they have good memories and can recall some of that, that's illuminating. But if I'm just getting kind of bullet point information, that fieldwork isn't always that revelatory, except that it tells you what was considered normal and what was considered an aberration, and sometimes that's useful. But yeah.
I think that point was actually, I should have said that too.
Well, we'll pretend
the people outside the system don't always understand what's going on. So you talk to them and they're kind of like, well, I don't know, right? And people inside the system though, like, I mean, Lisa and other people, they don't really necessarily understand the population they're dealing with as well. So there's a lot of bad communication there, or failure to understand, which makes field work difficult.
We have like 2 minutes left. Michael, Lisa?
Make it very fast. So for my research, it was really just based on the documents, but I did spend a year in Jordan, and it was before I was in graduate school, and I was there studying Arabic on the weekends. A particular bookshop and coffee shop would go to. A lot of Iraqis would go there, various ages, and I guess similar to Sam, I found a lot of discussion of the Ba'ath period to be refracted, one through like sectarian conflict in Iraq, but also I think Jordan's, I guess, location and the kind of Iran, Saudi Arabia struggle and the sectarian narratives in the region that predominated. Found pre-Ba'ath to be very interesting. Maybe memories of the 60s, even the monarchy the way people talked about it. I'll say quickly with respect to where interviews have been relevant to me now. So I found that talking with Iraqis involved with the capture and collection of documents has been most useful in figuring out some of the limitations, but also what was captured where, who has things that haven't been accounted for. Like I learned only recently that the Ba'ath Party's Northern Bureau records, which were missing from '91, which probably had some of the real smoking gun orders from Chemical Ali, just by the way events went in uprising, they didn't get to capture many of those. But it does appear that in 2003, the Peshmerga, when they took Kirkuk, captured a huge trove of government documents. And there's one KRG minister who started publishing stuff, clearly would access these things now. So I think doing interviews with people involved, it helps, one, getting the experiences of Iraqis, but also giving a better sense of the documentary paper trail and evidence too.
Okay, final word to you.
Yeah, the only thing I will add is when I started this project, my initial hope was to do interviews with Iraqis in San Diego. So I went to El Cajon and I found that they are all Chaldean Christians, or everyone I could get an interview with. And I, was trying to reconcile, okay, not that many of the documents are really focused on Chaldean Christians, like the Chaldani are there, but it's not a big part of the narrative. And then I'm talking to people who have a very particular take on the regime, their place in the regime. And so I ended up sort of saying I'm not getting as much out of this experience as I had hoped. And, Alyssa mentioned that there's no blood in the documents, but where you will actually hear about repression and the personal experience are in the oral histories. So that's actually part of the Iraq Memory Foundation collection as well. There are hours and hours and hours of oral history. And so, you don't see it written down in a memo, but you hear the impact on people's lives by watching the oral histories. So for me, that served as something of a substitute because, the Chaldean experience was a little too specific, I think, for what I was trying to do.
Great, thanks. And I would love to hear about the differences between what defected or captured Iraqi diplomats and military leaders told their interviewers versus what you actually found in the documents. But I won't put you on the spot for that. And I would also put in a plug that I think that in terms of mixing the documentary work with the field research and the oral histories, Dina Khoury's book, Iraq in Wartime, is simply unmatched. It's one of the best books I've ever read in terms of balancing those two. So we're going to take about a half an hour for lunch and then reconvene in some reconfigured version of this room for our final panel with Colin Call, Brett McGurk, and Lisa Blades. Thank you.